So, recently, I finished playing Elden Ring, and I loved it. I had a fantastic time with almost every single part of this game, except Malenia. Malenia can go frick herself. While the gameplay definitely was fun, I am not a game critic, and that is not what this channel is about. I am here to talk about the setting. Like all Souls games, and yes, I'm going to be referring to Elden Ring, Bloodborne, and Sekiro as Souls games, it's just easier that way. Elden Ring hides its lore behind item descriptions, NPC dialogue, and environmental storytelling. And, like most if not all Souls games, it has an interesting relationship with disability. And queerness, actually, but more on that later. The Souls games almost always include some aspect of disability. In the Dark Souls series, the Firekeepers all have some form of disability. In Bloodborne, we have Gehrman, who is an ambulatory wheelchair user, as well as a myriad of other chronically ill and disabled NPCs. Sekiro is, a core mechanic of the game is that the character you play has a prosthetic arm. I'm not too sure about Demon's Souls, because that's honestly the game I know least about, but even if there's nothing there, that's one game out of 6. The trend, unsurprisingly, continues in Elden Ring. Spoiler warning if you haven't played the game. One of the early NPCs you can interact with is Irina, a noble woman who has fled Castle Morn after an uprising by the misbegotten slaves there. She says her eyesight has been weak since birth, which would imply that she still has some vision, but in typical FromSoft fashion, she's just blindfolded. I will just drop a note that this is a tired trope at this point and move on. Her storyline ends with her being murdered, and her father swearing vengeance and eventually succumbing to the flame of frenzy and invading the player. Which does not surprise me, nor does it bother me, because this is a Souls game, and happy endings are a rarity. So I'm just going to cut you off at the pass here. The bury your disabled trope doesn't really apply. Miyazaki's worlds tend to be falling apart at the seams at all times, and this one was developed in cooperation with George R.R. Martin. NPCs can and will be killed off indiscriminately. The next disabled character you meet is most likely to be Hayeta, a young woman who wishes to be a Finger Maiden but can't seem to find her way. The Finger Maidens are this setting's Firekeepers. They're supposed to help a tarnished champion along their path guided by grace in service to the Two Fingers and the Greater Will. Essentially, they're the lore explanation for how and why you level up. Except the player doesn't really have a Finger Maiden, but that's not the point of this video. Now, Hayeta actually has a rather fascinating connection with the other blind maiden we just got done discussing. Not only does she look completely identical to Irina, the two also share a voice actress, and Hayeta will only appear in the place you first meet her after Irina has died. Which is all very fascinating from a lore perspective, but unfortunately not super relevant to this video. Hayeta will ask you if you have any Shabriri grapes that you can donate to her, because when she eats them, she can feel a distant guiding light at the back of her eyes. If you do, she will move to the next place you can meet her, where you can give her another grape, and then another, until she starts to wonder what they really are. At this point, you have a choice to make. You can tell her the truth, which is that she has been eating human eyes, or you can lie. If you tell her the truth, she will be horrified, and as you walk away, you can hear her being violently ill in the background. But the next time you speak with her, she will have rationalized away her horror, and now asks for a fingerprint grape, and you might be getting the feeling that something is terribly wrong here. You'd be correct. She's not being guided to be a finger maiden for the 2 fingers, but rather for the maddening 3 fingers who serve the Flame of Frenzy. If you continue her story, she'll eventually show up at the deepest point of Leyndell, the Erdtree capital, where long ago the people of the Great Caravan were buried alive for their supposed heretical beliefs. Here you can choose to be burned by the 3 fingers and make her a proper finger maiden, but if you do, she will die almost immediately afterwards. Alongside Irina and Hayeta, you'll also meet the sorcerer Roger, who isn't disabled when you first meet him, but becomes disabled soon after. Though it's more like he becomes terminally ill, a side effect of which is his disability. At this point, he'll give you his sword because he has no more use for it, and continue to guide you until he dies. You can later end up fighting an apparition of him if you go into the Deeproot Depths to follow Fia's questline, but that makes sense to me because his disability was an effect of the thing that was killing him. Millicent is another who you can meet. To me, she seems like the most central disabled NPC, but she is technically locatable in an area that is entirely optional. Like, I don't know who is running through Limgrave and then Liurnia and directly to Altus and never stopping by Caelid, but you can technically miss her entirely if that's how you choose to play the game. You'll first find her in the Church of the Plague in Caelid. She's afflicted by the Scarlet Rot, a horrible disease in this setting that, as you might guess, rots a person from within. So far, for her, it has claimed her sword arm. If you talk to the Sage Gowry, her adoptive father, he'll ask you to find an unalloyed gold needle to give her, which will stall the sickness. This is because the Scarlet Rot is an effect caused by an outer god, known only as the god that was wrought itself, and the unalloyed gold needle was created specifically to hinder the meddling of outer gods. Later on, you can find her a prosthetic arm, and she'll help you in some fights if you summon her. At the end of her story, you can choose either to help or to betray her. If you help her, you'll fight her sisters with her, and then find her in the area you just fought in. She's removed the needle, deciding that she would rather die on her own terms than continue to walk down this path that would have her bloom into something other than herself. Additionally, you might argue that Melina, our in-game guide and pretend finger maiden, is disabled. She is, after all, burned and bodiless, and one of her eyes appears to be sealed shut. And she can't move about the world outside the capital without someone to travel with. Her storyline, when you don't accept the Flame of Frenzy, ends with her setting herself alight to burn the Erdtree, so we can progress and mend the Elden Ring. In the Lord of Frenzied Flame ending, however, we get a final cutscene wherein she swears to hunt us down to the ends of the earth, and this time both of her eyes are open, but surprisingly now her previously open eye has this white film over it, which is often used as a lazy shorthand for blindness in media. So at the end of the day, I think there's definitely enough here to say that she is disabled in some form. Those 4 are, to my mind at least, the most notable disabled NPCs who you can speak with, and whose storylines you can somewhat affect. At first, you might think Raya is disabled because her posture looks kind of like she has hyperkyphosis, but she's just a snake person, so we're moving on. Following that, we have Miquella and Malenia, the twin children of Marika and her second husband, King Consort Radagon. Before I really discuss them, I do have to lay some groundwork about Marika and Radagon, and this is now serious spoiler territory. If you didn't heed the warning before, this is your final chance. Marika is Radagon. That is what we know for sure at the point in game that our character is interacting with the world. There are several different ways to interpret this, but my personal theory is that Radagon was always an aspect of Marika. I don't know if he was aware of that when he marched on Liurnia and met its queen and fell in love with her. Maybe both Marika and Radagon knew, maybe Marika knew but Radagon didn't. If Marika didn't know, I'm damn sure Radagon didn't, because Marika seems to be the primary source for this particular god. But the point is, at that point in time, I do think they were distinct, separate beings, while still being connected, much in the way certain mythological figures are at once the same deity and not the same person. My main reason for thinking this is that while Radagon's children with his first wife Renala are called Marika's demigod stepchildren, we're also told that all of the demigods are Marika's direct offspring.
The demigods are each and all the direct offspring of Queen Marika.
Which implies that somehow Radagon's children with Renala are Marika's through more than just marriage. Unless Radagon truly had nothing to do with Marika before they got married and it worked retroactively, which isn't out of the question. Weirder things have happened in FromSoft games. Either way, once Marika and Radagon were married, they had their twins, Miquella and Malenia, both Empyreans, that is to say demigods with the potential to rise to true godhood, but both also born cursed, as they were the children of a single god. I also think that Melina is Marika's daughter, but I think she is different from Miquella and Malenia in one key way. That is to say that Miquella and Malenia were born of Marika and Radagon's union while they were separate entities, but Melina was born of Marika after Radagon had already become her, in a more asexual reproduction sense. Either way, Miquella was born cursed to an eternal childhood. While his mind certainly matured, his body remained eternally small and frail. Malenia, meanwhile, was born already afflicted with the Scarlet Rot. For a while the two of them served the Golden Order, but when Miquella could find no cure for Malenia's sickness within it, the two of them left in search of answers. Miquella created the unalloyed gold needle I mentioned earlier to help his sister, and Malenia took the title Blade of Miquella. Together, they established the lands of Miquella's Haligtree, where Miquella watered the new growth with his own blood. The goal, as far as I can see, was to create a land where the downtrodden and outcast could live in peace. Particularly the Albinaurics, an artificial species who were severely mistreated and experimented on by their creators. The Albinaurics are interesting too because they seem to exist in two different ways. Either this small, squat, frog-like appearance, or a far more human look. As far as I can glean, if they are the same creature in different life stages, the frog-like ones are the youngsters, and as they age, they grow more humanoid, but as a trade-off lose mobility in their legs. Their warriors compensate for this by riding wolves, and it's really cool, but fighting them is a pain and a half. The Albinauric life cycle does seem tied to their legs somehow. When those finally fade, so do their lives. At least, that's what I gathered from old Albus before he died right in front of me.
My legs will soon fade, and with them my life. Alas, this is the immovable fate of all Albinaurics.
Despite the noble intentions, Miquella's Haligtree failed to grow into an Erdtree because of interference by Moog, the Lord of Blood. More on him later. Malenia, meanwhile, almost met her match in her half-brother General Radahn, and was forced to unleash her Scarlet Rot over Caelid, creating the Swamp of Aeonia and Caelid's current rot-blighted state. When you fight her in-game, the Scarlet Rot has progressed to a point where she has one prosthetic arm and 2 prosthetic legs. When she progresses to her second stage, she might actually go blind from its continuing spread, but obviously we don't see her again after we've defeated her, so that's mostly just speculation. And last but not least, you really can't discuss disability in Elden Ring without talking about the Omen. Omen are people who are born cursed, with horns sprouting all over their bodies, their dreams haunted by something horrifying. Typically, when an Omen is born, they will have their horns excised, which will kill them, but when an Omen is born to nobility, they will instead be hidden away in the subterranean shunning grounds beneath the capital. This is depressingly realistic, despite the fantastical nature of the disability in question. Of the Omen in-game, there are two who are particularly important to discuss, those being Mohg and Morgott. They are the twin sons of Queen Marika and her first husband, Lord Godfrey. Despite being demigods, they were still locked away beneath the capital, and as they grew, they took polar opposite routes in life. Morgott, despite the horrific treatment that he and people like him suffered, remained loyal to his mother's Erdtree and her Golden Order. When everything fell to ruin, he became the last Lord of Leyndell, guarding the entrance to the Erdtree and sealing the road to the Forbidden Lands beyond the Erdtree capital. He also sealed the entrance to the pit where you find the Three Fingers, which is not really relevant, it's just interesting. When you fight him the second time, yes, second, because he is actually the first major boss in the game, you might have heard of him. A lot of people were swearing about him on Twitter.
Let it be Margit the Fell.
Either way, you can clearly hear the self-hatred he carries. When he enters his second stage, he will lament that his foul blood has tainted this holy place. He loved the Erdtree and the Golden Order, but received no love in return. In all, he is a profoundly misguided and tragic character. Then there is Mohg, his twin brother and narrative foil, who sought an audience with the Formless Mother, an outer god who demanded a wound, so Mohg decided he would become the Lord of Blood and begin a new dynasty, the Mohgwyn dynasty. But Mohg is not an Empyrean. He alone cannot establish a new order. The only Empyreans we know of are Marika, Mohg's mother, Ranni, his stepsister, and Miquella and Malenia, his half-siblings. Well, there is also the Gloam-Eyed Queen, but evidence points to her being long dead by the time the story plays out, so she's not really relevant to this calculation. Marika had already risen to godhood and is locked in the Erdtree, so she is not a viable option. Ranni has disappeared off of the map entirely. Malenia would absolutely wipe the floor with him, but Miquella is frail, so Mohg took his chance while Malenia was in Caelid fighting General Radahn, and ripped Miquella from the Haley Tree. His goal was to raise Miquella to true godhood and become his consort, so he could rightfully claim the title of Lord in Miquella's new order. But try as he might to share his blood-soaked bedchamber, he never got a response. Which is good, because Miquella is both his half-brother, ew, and, as I already said, cursed to forever have the body of a child, double ew. Though the hand we see emerging from Miquella's cocoon in Mohg's boss fight area looks quite a bit larger than what we saw of him in the opening cutscene, so it's very likely something happened there. Maybe we'll get some answers in future DLC. I really hope any future DLC gives us more on Miquella, because so far he's my favorite of the demigods in this setting. Elden Ring's approach to disability is very much in keeping with Souls games, which is not the least bit surprising. Despite the bleakness of the world and the high fantasy post-apocalyptic feel that they're so well known for from the original Souls games, the disabilities and the disabled characters in this game never come across as tragedies because of their disabilities. Irina's story is tragic because her father's fervor to defend his post led him to neglect her safety, and ultimately to her death. Hayeta's story is tragic because she was misled by the Three Fingers, and while she technically became a Finger Maiden in the end, I highly doubt this is what she wanted in the beginning. Millicent's story isn't tragic because she lost an arm, it's tragic because she faces the impossible choice of dying on her own terms, or continuing to fight and eventually becoming something other, something she doesn't recognize or want. Miquella and Malenia aren't tragedies because of their curses, but rather because of how the safe haven they almost created fell into ruin thanks to a few unkind chances and the actions of others. The Omen aren't tragedies because of their curse, but rather because of how society treats them for it. The Albinorics aren't even oppressed for being disabled. That's just incidental to the real issue for them. In this game, you will find disabled characters with wants, needs, and goals all across the board. Morality in Souls games is always grey, but one thing you can count on is that it will be varied. And that shows here as well. Just like any other NPC, the disabled characters are just people with their own goals and reasons. Even Moog, who is definitely the most reprehensible out of all the characters I've described here, has solid, understandable reasoning behind his actions, and was shaped by the cruelty he faced in his youth. That's the key difference here, and why I'm so fascinated with how Elden Ring portrays disability. Queerness, on the other hand, that's a little bit newer to the Souls games. In Dark Souls, we had Darksun Gwyndolin, who has a lot of ways you could read their lore. They were the last child of Gwyn, and while they were assigned male at birth, they had a strong affiliation with the moon's power, which in this setting is a feminine attribute. This led Gwyn to raise them as a daughter. This has led some people to speculate that Gwyndolin might have been a trans woman, though personally, the way the story is laid out, it reads more like fearmongering about transing our kids than any genuine trans experience. But if you headcanon them as a trans woman, I'm not gonna knock that. I personally see them more as, like, genderqueer, but really, it's up to interpretation. They technically return in Dark Souls 3, but they don't really have a great time in that one. They're being actively devoured by a god-eater. Bloodborne's Ariana, a sex worker you can save or accidentally lead to her death, depending on your choices, will still be a little bit flirty with a female hunter, but her most blatant dialogue is different between a female and male hunter, implying she would not accept a woman as a client, which is obviously her prerogative, but decreases the potential lesbianism significantly. Elden Ring, similarly, has a very interesting relationship with queerness. On the one hand, if you play it as a male character, the only instance of anything remotely queer is Moog kidnapping his eternally a-child half-brother in hopes of becoming his consort. Which isn't great, obviously. Arguably, Radagon and Marika, once united into the same being, have some potential for gender shenanigans, but we don't see enough of them for it to make an impact, and in all honesty, with Marika shattering the Elden Ring and Radagon attempting to repair it, they don't come across as a single individual, even after they've become one. On the other hand, if you play as a woman, well, then queerness becomes an integral, unshakable part of the whole experience. See, the end goal of Elden Ring, as set to you by the Two Fingers, vassals of the Greater Will, is to become Elden Lord. And who is the Elden Lord? Why, Queen Marika's consort, of course. If your character is a woman, she will be told by literally the highest power in the primary religious order in this setting, go marry a woman. This firmly establishes the fact that homophobia cannot exist in the lands between. There are countless other injustices happening every second, but at least that one cannot exist because this game has gender select. Also because Moog foresaw no issues choosing Miquella as his target Empyrean, implying that if they had gotten married, it would have been recognized. Troubling, considering just about everything else about the situation, but at least it implies good things about the attitude towards same-sex marriage in this universe. So you win some, you lose some, I guess. Additionally, you can choose to instead become Lunar Princess Rani's consort and help her usher in her order instead. And then there's Fia and her definitely not at all suggestive hugs. Basically, if you play the game as a woman, there is no possible way to escape the queerness. So at least I can rest easy in that I could most likely just be myself if I were a resident of the Lands Between. Would my life be miserable and probably cut short because the world is actively falling apart and everything is horrible? Sure. But at least I wouldn't be hate-crimed for wanting to hold a man's hand. But that's about all I have to say on that. If you have any theories on Elden Ring that you'd like to share, feel free to share them in the comments. If you disagree with any of the theories that I mentioned in this video, also feel free to tell me in the comments, because honestly, theory crafting is one of my favorite things in the world, and I'm always keen to hear what others are working on. But thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, consider liking it and maybe subscribing. I will be back here Thursday after next. Bye!